Welcome to the Pitch Boxing app, and we have with us, delighted to say, Kieran Cunningham, the chief sports writer of the Irish Daily Star. How are you, Kieran?
Hi, Martin. Not too bad.
You're a man in very high demand right now at present, I suspect, and we're going to lay the scene as to why. This is slightly different to our usual boxing content, which is very much sports focused and in-ring focused. This is an out-of-ring focused conversation, and the reason for that being the kind of breaking news over the last 24 hours around the Daniel Kinahan situation, which has direct kind of knock-on effects with boxing and the world of boxing, and a man who, to set the scene for those that may not be aware, an advisor to the likes of Tyson Fury, Billy Joe Saunders, Josh Taylor, Sonny Edwards in the past, possibly still, we don't really know. And Kieran, you have been covering this for a very long time, this story, and one of the few kind of voices that's spoken up about the scenario over the years. Can you kind of give us your background as to where that's come, or your involvement in it's come from?
Well, I suppose boxing wouldn't be my specialty. I cover all sports, but I would cover boxing, at the Olympics, or would have covered when Irish fighters have had big fights, and at a world level or whatever. I covered a lot of Katie Taylor's fights as an amateur pro, etc. So, and done a lot of feature interviews. But what really sparked my interest in this as a bigger story was the Regency shooting when a man was killed at a boxing weigh-in 6 years ago. And the target of that shooting was Daniel Kinahan, but he escaped. He was at the weigh-in, but he escaped. And it was such a remarkable thing to happen, that someone was shot dead at a boxing weigh-in. I thought I'd looked into the story and look into it more. And the more I looked into it, to me, it's the biggest Irish sports story I've ever come across, because boxing is one of the only truly global sports, and he's become such a power broker on the world stage. And just looking into how this was allowed to happen. And, mostly the story has been covered by crime journalists. Most sports journalists have stayed away from it for various reasons. And I can understand a fair bit. You don't want to be dealing with people like these, a lot of people, and I can understand why that is the case. But to me, it was a story that, couldn't be ignored, and you had to get into. It's been a difficult story to cover because it's very hard to get people to talk on the record. It's easier actually to get people to talk on the record in favor of Daniel Kinahan's involvement than against it. You will find people who generally are making a bit of money out of him that they're quick to talk in his favor, and you get a fair bit of abuse, especially online stuff over it. So. But it goes with the territory. But, this move now, because there have been moves by police forces and different crime agencies in Ireland, the UK and Spain. They've approached Dubai and the UAE trying to bring Daniel Kinahan to justice and trying to get him extradited. But they don't have, particularly Ireland on the world stage, wouldn't have anything like the power that America has. Like when America intervenes now, it's hugely significant. The fact that the press conference yesterday, the American ambassador to Ireland spoke at it. The Americans, generally countries are careful with what their ambassadors talk about. And the fact that she spoke out about this, announcing a reward of $5 million for information that would lead to his capture, this is really significant. And it's hugely significant for boxing because of the way this could pan out. Like, we don't know exactly what the repercussions will be yet. But given Kinahan's ties to different bodies within boxing, some we can name, some we can't. You could be looking at kind of house of cards. A lot of this falls apart, and it could affect the broadcasters as well, because a few of those that might have negotiated with Kinahan might well be running scared of the sport now, and there might be recriminations because of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points to pick apart there. I'm going to have a go at starting. You mentioned the $5 million reward for information leading to the finding of Daniel Kinahan. So that's been put in place by the US Treasury. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, for those that may not follow boxing, for instance, my mum, who will follow certain elements of boxing, this became BBC News front page story yesterday.
Yeah.
In line with the likes of the Panorama documentary about Daniel Kinahan, this became front page of the BBC Sport website and BBC News website. It's almost unprecedented, isn't it, that somebody within boxing? I know that there's always those that turn it around, and that whataboutery element of, there's always been people that have been, had slightly dubious backgrounds, perhaps involved in the sport. But to have a $5 million almost bounty from the US Treasury, I can't think of anything similar to that.
No, definitely not in sport, and nor in boxing, and I know boxing, like people throw it all at you all the time, and you bring up anything that's untoward, they say that's boxing, like whether it's judging, whether it's, widespread corruption, but you can't explain away everything like that. You can't constantly refer to Don King killing someone 60 years ago, or Blinky Palermo and Frankie Carbo 60, 70 years ago. And what people forget about Frankie Carbo was known as the mob's unofficial commissioner for boxing, but he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And what he was sentenced for was corruption within boxing. So he was actually brought to justice. Daniel Kinahan hasn't been brought before a court. So, boxing, the maximum reward they can actually offer the US is $5 million. So that's the scale of the seriousness they take. Like, they couldn't offer any more. $5 million is all they're allowed under their legislation. But the fact that they've done that and gone so public, it becomes a global story then. And it becomes, because boxing is a world with so many interconnections, you just see, if you were to draw a graph or a family tree, the people who have connected or dealt with Daniel Kinahan, there's a hell of a lot of people there, in boxing. So a hell of a lot of people would be feeling a bit nervous now, because one of the things that came out of the press conference yesterday, there were some companies named that he's involved in. And basically, the investigation means the accounts of those companies are frozen and they're not allowed to do business. Now, say if this but they said at the press conference yesterday, this is only the start. And basically said more companies are going to be named. Now, if this investigation goes into some of the boxing companies that we think he might be linked to, and they're stopped from operating, and their accounts are frozen, what's the implications for boxing then? It's huge. So it's one of the most significant days in the modern history of boxing. I really think that. It's because the guy had become very powerful. If you talk to people behind the scenes, he was a major power broker. So many people were giving him credit. Even though when you try to talk to people and say, did you actually negotiate with Daniel Kinahan? People would say no, or ignore the question. But it's clear a lot of people were.
Yeah, one of the things to pick out from that, as you mentioned, is that there is no there's no criminal conviction against Daniel Kinahan, which, to be quite clear about, there is no criminal conviction against Daniel Kinahan. There may be amounts laid against him that the US government are interested in speaking to him, but there is no criminal conviction. Do you think that line still works? Because that's one that I have seen many people throw back to you, Kieran, online. I won't mention any names, but they're the fairly common ones that, for anyone that follows you on social media or follows the story, it's the line that always gets put back to.
Yeah. No, you see it a lot. Yeah. No, I think it will be harder to use that line because, even in the past, a judge here at the 79 members, explain this to you, Martin, quickly. 79 members of the Kinahan Cartel have been brought to justice in the last couple of years. The National Crime Agency a couple of weeks ago in the UK, when Thomas Kavanagh, who's one of the main lieutenants in the cartel, when he was jailed for 21 years, it was the first time in the UK that, publicly there had been mention of the Kinahan organised crime gang. And that is significant, and it's widely recognized that Daniel Kinahan is the head of that cartel. You had in the special criminal court in Dublin, the judge accepting the evidence that he was head of a gang that's involved in execution type killings. That was one of the charges against him. So even though the convictions aren't there, one of the reasons he hasn't been before a court is he's in Dubai. There's no extradition agreement there. There have been negotiations behind the scenes for years now, trying to get him back here. But because there's no extradition agreement, and Ireland isn't a major power, they can't put the pressure on. But there's what they call a super cartel, and there was a guy from the Italian Camorra, Raffaelli and Piriali, and a Dutch gangster as well. And both of those were Daniel Kinahan's wedding in Dubai, and the strong connections to him, and they lived with him. Both of those have been extradited in the last 6 months. So Dubai is coming under more pressure to give in to these demands. So if anyone throws that line at me again, you just, like even Bob Arum, you look at the U-turn Bob Arum has made, a man who was so publicly supportive of Daniel Kinahan. And now he said, the US doesn't do things lightly. When the US say these kind of things, the US authorities, we have to take it seriously.
That's right. Bob Arum previously called him the captain, didn't he? Called him Captain Dan.
Yeah. And he says he's our man in the Middle East. He's the captain. He's the man who makes things happen. Yeah. That's what he said.
And then came out yesterday, and I think his exact wording was that we wouldn't have any further relationship with Daniel Kinahan. It may not be verbatim, but it was along those.
Yeah. He's done a few interviews. Like he said, he did one on Irish radio this morning as well. Like he's done a few interviews, basically cutting all ties and saying, when the US authorities at that level say this stuff, we have to say, take it on trust.
Yeah. Haven't we seen that before? As in the public declaration that we being whoever it is talking about it, will no longer have relationships with Daniel Kinahan. I'm sure there are various individuals in the sport that have made that declaration that.
Yeah, well there's a lot of, like one of the things that strikes you when you cover this story for a few years ago is how many people blatantly lie, Martin.
No.
Yeah. But even not saying but MTK, for example, issued a statement saying Daniel Kinahan's left the company, completely sold his stake, he's no involvement. And then it became clear because boxers was saying, MTK boxer was saying, thanks to Daniel, Daniel's organized this fight, Daniel's my advisor. So then they had to admit, he advises some of our fighters in an unofficial capacity. And they'd said before he has no involvement at all with us or our boxers. So what do you believe? Like a lot of people are telling you stuff that you have to be skeptical about because you hear enough talking to people to know that what he's involved in and who he's involved with. But like to cover the story, there's been a lot of heavyweight lawyers brought on board, and they're very quick. Like even I emailed one organization that seemed to have connections to Daniel Kinahan, and it was only an email with a few questions. This wasn't made public. It was to them, and I got threatening emails back from a solicitor saying this was libelous and defamatory. And all I was doing was asking questions, and that hadn't been published or anything. So. But they do that because they think it will intimidate you. And they've recruited some of the most highly regarded defamation lawyers around, in the ones with some of the strongest reputation for winning cases. And that's all basically to try and silence the media. And see, the way the boxing media works, it's different to some other sports because you're very dependent on keeping sweet with the people in power. Like it's different. If you write articles critical of FIFA, you'll probably still get accreditation for the World Cup, or else it'll be uproar. The same like if you're slagging off the tennis authorities, you still get accreditation for Wimbledon or whatever. But if you're slagging off Eddie Hearn, you probably won't get into a matchroom fight, or anybody else. I'm only using Eddie as an example, but. Yeah. Basically the promoters and the managers have a ridiculous amount of power in terms of the media. So many people in the media feel under pressure not to rock the boat because they're under pressure to be at the big fights. If you write what you think about Tyson Fury's relationship with Daniel Kinahan, and then you're told you can't do the Tyson Fury fight, your editor might be looking at you going, what have you done, here? So I could see that there's a bind there. It's a difficult relationship and there's a complicated relationship.
Yeah, and you're one of the few, and when I say one of the few, I think of Nicola Tallant, I think of Al Dawson, I think of yourself, that have publicly in the past spoken of, reported on these considerations within boxing. Do you think that now changes? I mean, over the last 24 hours, I've seen more commentary, shows like this, for instance, that these conversations have gone on. Like, I think everybody appreciates these conversations have gone on elsewhere, just not necessarily in front of a camera or on record. But have you seen a more willing or more openness within the last 24 hours than maybe over the last 3 years to...
Well, obviously there's been more coverage, but just to explain that, if you go back to June 2020, when Tyson Fury's Instagram post thanking Daniel Kinahan for supposedly arranging the fight with Anthony Joshua, that never actually happened. Yeah, but you go back to that. No, there was a reaction to that because a lot of people, particularly in Ireland, you were suddenly pointing out, do you know who Daniel Kinahan is? And because of that, there was stuff written in the UK across, and there was a fair bit of coverage in the UK, a bit in America, a bit in Germany. It was covered elsewhere, and then it died down because people move on to something else, a Lions tour, or Olympics, or Premier League season, or whatever. But you do notice, and I see that happening again, like, because suddenly what happened yesterday was so amazing. There's a fair bit of coverage around across the board for people who don't normally cover boxing in the UK today. But I think what will be an interesting test is next week, Martin, because there will be pressers ahead of the Tyson Fury Dillian White fight. And no matter how they try and control it, I think questions have to be asked next week because Tyson Fury has been so vocal in his support of Daniel Kinahan. And he's a guy who doesn't like hard questions. Like, his reaction will be interesting. But I think, I know accreditation, I think, for the pressers is closed last week, but I think you'll find there will be pressure put on the organizers to let in journalists who don't normally cover boxing, because now this has become a far bigger story than Tyson Fury v. Dillian White. This will be the first chance to really follow up on this story properly with a prominent figure in boxing, I think.
I was going to ask the question around that. As you say, it's next Saturday, the Dillian White versus Tyson Fury fight. Is there, do you think, any risk whatsoever to that fight going ahead, in that Tyson has been very vocal in the past about having Daniel Kinahan as his advisor, as you say, roll back June 2020, and he publicly declared it. I know since then there seems to have been a separation between Tyson Fury and Daniel Kinahan publicly. But do you think there's any risk whatsoever from a broadcast?
Well, I'm not sure, Martin, if there is a separation. It was photographed with him in Dubai only, I think, 2 months ago. So I'm not sure how real that separation is. I don't know. The short answer is I don't know if there's a threat to the fight. I honestly don't know. The big issue that's going to come up now, I think, is the broadcasters. Because all professional sports depend on TV money, and boxing maybe more than most. Like, boxing was the first sport really to embrace pay-per-view and pay TV, and it became very, very dependent on that money. But I know for a fact that behind the scenes, there are a few TV executives have got very nervy over this. Because this could have roll-on effect in terms of scaring off advertisers, and they might think even subscribers, because you don't want to be seen to have been in bed with a guy like this with all the questions that are crowding around him. And if even a broadcaster or two turned their back on boxing, like, where do you go? Like, you're going to end up on YouTube with your own, your own streaming service and a very marginal, tiny audience. So I don't know how it's going to pan out, Mark. Nobody does, but I think there are repercussions. I don't think this is something that's going to blow over. It's too big.
It's interesting. You say about the broadcasters, and it almost seems, and I might be wrong, and it's purely opinion, it's not fact. There seems to have been almost a positioning by each of the individuals that you associate with the broadcasters. So perhaps Eddie Hearn with DAZN, Adam Smith with Sky, Frank Warren with BT. Not to say those three individuals specifically, just to be very clear, but there seems to be a positioning from each of them over time to maybe move themselves away from the Daniel Kinahan name and almost name drop others from other stations.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a very clear, almost trying to throw others under the bus ahead of time positioning?
Whether it's just, I'm not sure whether it's, just be careful how I phrase it. It's definitely deliberate, Mark. It's definitely deliberate in the sense, it's quite interesting when, you do see the odd time that a question is put about Daniel Kinahan, how there's an answer that's kind of well thought out in advance, it seems to me, and it kind of talking around an issue and maybe pointing to somebody else. Yeah, I know I can see the point you're making there, but it's a dangerous game because there's so many of them have, there's photographs there. Frank Warren at dinner with Daniel Kinahan. We've seen that photograph. There's a photograph of Eddie Hearn and Matthew Macklin at dinner with Daniel Kinahan. There's so many connections. They keep saying they cannot say they don't know this guy. And, you know, with everything that's gone on, you cannot pretend that up till yesterday you'd never heard any of this stuff. Everybody's heard it for years. It's just the fact that the US authorities are coming out and saying it now. You're going, wow, you can't ignore it now. But they've known, they've known this, what's been said about it. Nobody can pretend they can't. They haven't,
Do you feel vindicated over the last 24 hours for your efforts, time, energy, risk that you've taken in trying to highlight this issue, and that now people are almost more willing to talk about it, accept it, and deal with it, like have an adult conversation about it now more than ever before?
No, to be honest, being perfectly honest, I wouldn't say vindicated. I would say relieved, because you do feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall. And it does, it's like I've been working on a podcast series around it. It'll be called Shadow Boxing. It'll be 4 parts. I've interviewed a fair amount of people for it. And just taking a broader look at the whole story and how this happened and where boxing is, whatever. And because of that, like that's been ongoing for about 6 months. It's taken up a lot of my headspace. Like I've other things going on in my life as well. And so you're suddenly seeing yesterday and think, oh, this might come to an end eventually, and there might be a move. It doesn't suddenly mean boxing will be all sweetness and light, but it would be a great day for the sport to get a guy like that out of it, particularly for the boxing in Ireland, because it's really suffered because of him. And like boxing is Ireland's international sport, more Olympic medals than in any other sport. At professional level, more European and world titles than in any other sport. But, you haven't had a major boxing event in Dublin since the Regency. Only small hall shows have been allowed. And that's largely, not only, but largely because of security concerns. So there's a lot of really good people in Irish boxing. There's a lot of people that have stepped beyond the pale because of the way they got into bed with Daniel Kinahan as well. It has to be said. But for the good people in the sport, I'd be relieved and I'd be happy. And I'd hope that the sport can recover because of it. Because I think he has been toxic for the sport. I really think, the people who talk him up do it because they've made money out of him. But you don't want to be, if that's how you're making money, it's not worth it. You're better off in the dole.
And there are organisations that are linked. MTK has the obvious link to Daniel Kinahan from the past, and then officially they separated a number of years ago when they switched from the MGM to the MTK naming, and they stepped away from both Matthew Macklin and Daniel Kinahan. Now, it's not me linking it, but I think it was the sports minister of Pakistan when he tweeted out the image of himself and Daniel Kinahan and mentioned about Probellum being an organisation that was linked with Daniel Kinahan. So not me, it was I think it was the sports minister of Pakistan at the time. Do you see those organisations and any other within sport? And I know there was a sports management company that was named by the US sanctions yesterday. Do you see or foresee any boxing company being named in that second phase of sanctions that come along? And I mean directly by name.
Well, it's obviously speculation, but I think it could happen, because I think they're looking, like there's a lot of companies well, not a lot of, how would I express it? The Kinahans have invested hugely in all sorts of areas. They've invested hugely in property, like even around the Olympics. I know somebody who was staying in an apartment in Rio at the Rio Olympics, and it was owned by Daniel Kinahan. I know that for a fact. So they have property all over the place. They have businesses, all sorts of businesses. Like one of the businesses yesterday named was a company making vodka in Glasgow. So it's all sorts of things. All sorts of things could be drawn into it. To say, so of course I think boxing management company could be brought into it. We don't know, and it wouldn't surprise me, because one of the things that the Irish police were saying in the press conference yesterday is that they did highlight the involvement in boxing. And that this is one of the reasons they're very keen to take Daniel Kinahan down. They think it's very damaging for the sport. So I think the authorities will be trying to look into any company in boxing that could have any links to him, and trying to dig to the bottom of it, because there's a lot of unexplained questions about a couple of companies that have made very rapid progress and with where that money came from, because they've never given us proper explanations for that.
And do you think there's a potential knock-on implication to this, and I know we're talking in hypotheticals slightly, but do you think there's a potential that the UK government get involved in any of this? And I mean specifically actually around the potential of boxing in, say, England, and we've got the British Boxing Board of Control that sanction and regulate over here. Do you think there's any risk the government will start to want questions answered around the governance and licensing?
There's a possibility, but the honest answer is I don't know. But I think that there are questions for governing bodies within the sport there. You know, like even at amateur level, I think is it called the Lonsdale Cup? I think there's a competition. I think it's called the MTK Lonsdale Cup. That's for amateurs there. And then a lot of companies now that are, like the amateur, an amateur body there took sponsorship from MTK, and I think questions will be asked now. Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable that this sponsorship has no connection in any way to Daniel Kinahan? And I could see more political pressure coming on, because in a way for politicians it's win-win, because it's a kind of a popular cause. If you're seen to be taking on a guy like this and cleaning up a sport and saying we're helping the sport in deprived areas and marginalized communities, you might get a bit of public support for it. So for that reason, you could see some politicians latching onto it.
And as a final one, do you foresee in 6 months' time there's going to be, and again, I know we're talking hypothetical, so apologies, but do you foresee there will be a second phase where perhaps, does there come a time when Daniel Kinahan is back in Ireland, do you think? I suppose is a different way of wording it.
Well, before yesterday, I wouldn't have been so sure. After yesterday, I think there's a fairly good chance. I think yesterday, and that was the start of the end game. I can't see how he can come out of this now. Where does he go? If he sets foot in European soil, he'll be arrested. If he's not allowed to go into America, I think UAE, because of the pressure that's coming on them, and that part of the world, we're so conscious now of wanting, tourism and wanting to host major events, etc. People are going to be asking themselves, is it worth it, harboring a guy like this, or being seen to harbor a guy like this? So I think there's a much better chance than was there before of Daniel Kinahan ending up in a court. And that court could be in Spain as much as Ireland. Like the Spanish police want him as well. So, but I think his days are numbered now. I think his days in boxing now are definitely numbered.
And do you see, is there any other sport in the world that you've covered as a chief sports writer for the Irish Daily Star? Is there any other sport in the world aside from boxing where this could have happened? Because I think Lou DiBella called it the Wild West of sports, boxing.
Yeah.
Is there any other sport? And I know every sport has its characters and its people that, football has a fit and proper person's test before you own a club. And there are lots of question marks over, the individuals that bought Newcastle, for instance.
Yeah.
But this is allegedly a very different scenario. Is there any other sport where stuff like this goes on? Or is it just boxing that harbours this kind of behaviour?
I can't think of any other example that's comparable to it, and it really highlights a lack of governance, Martin. Because, like, if Daniel Kinahan wanted to go into his local boxing club, like say he was living in Ireland or the UK, and he wanted to coach under 12s or whatever, he would have to be police vetted, and that's right and proper that you have to be police vetted, right? But he wouldn't pass the most basic of police vetting to coach underage kids. But he's able to buy himself into a major global sport and get himself into a position of incredible power within that global sport purely because he has money. It's ludicrous. It's complete madness. The fact that Robert Smith of the British Boxing Board of Control can say in public, emphatically, he would not get a manager's license. But he's been a manager for a long time. But because the fact he calls himself an advisor, he gets away with it. And it's ludicrous. There's no way around that. It's so loose that you can just get around the regulations, because there are really no regulations. It is lawless. It is the Wild West.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, and probably forever will. I mean, the fact that it's so disparate as a sport around the world lends itself to vacuums that can be filled by individuals. we anyway, Kieran, I appreciate your time so much. I appreciate you are probably a very busy man right now with many questions to answer from different people, but just say thank you for your ongoing efforts and reporting and questions that have been asked and now answers that are starting to come out about it. So it's hugely appreciated.
No problem. Thanks, Martin. Enjoyed it. Good man.